Hello everyone and welcome back to the Slow Car Salon. In the last wiring video, you saw how to put together the main engine harness here. But now it's a matter of trying to make that engine harness work with the car. There are a few preparatory actions we need to make here in the engine bay, including even putting everything together in such a way that I can actually test and turn the key and see if the motor will actually start. So we're going to get going with that first. So let's get started. Alright, so to start, there's some wiring to be addressed here in the chassis. We have the battery connection, which I'll have to take a bunch of these wires, consolidate them into this single blue 4-gauge wire, and bring possibly across in below the radiator up to my distribution post. I think a lot of these plugs, based on my research, can be deleted, of course, except for the alternator plug, which I will have notes on how you wire up the 1UZ alternator plug, so make sure you grab that. All the rest of these I believe we can just get rid of. They're all either check connectors or O2 sensors or even this filter. I think we might be able to keep that filter, but I'll have to double check. All these check connectors, yeah, essentially get deleted. Then we go across, we have some wires that run underneath the radiator that come into this, and one of these is the starter motor trigger and the other is the starter motor power. Now, if these are still tied into the battery, then that's fine. Although this trigger wire, based on the way I'm going to wire this up, I will not be reusing that. The rest of these are transmission connections that go towards the transmission down here near the firewall on the right hand side of the car. You will keep those. And this one is for the oil pressure sending unit. This I'll have to take out of this loom and bring back over here, because underneath my remote oil filter lines, right there actually, you can see where my finger is pointing, there is the oil pressure sending unit. So that single wire will have to be extended over to the left-hand side of the engine bay, since it was over here on the right on the 22RE. Then the body connections here, I've just loosely connected them to show you what stays. These are some additional check connectors. This 2-pin one is particularly for the fuel pump. I am not sure that this will function based on my new wiring. This is for the AC. That will have to be bridged back over here to trigger the AC compressor, which I'll do later, as AC is not exactly the main thing I want to address here. And then we have some other body connections here. This green and clear plug, those have to be plugged in. This needs to be grounded. And then I think that pretty much solves everything else as far as the body connections. But main thing, of course, is going to be your alternator connection, your charge wire. I think this is, yeah, these are linked together later on. So I think, yeah, the alternator charge wire, I'll just make my own link from the alternator down here to the distribution post. Then take our battery connection here and put those into some nice crimps. And actually, now for this connection, I do want to quickly mention that that is something you don't want to solder. For that, I got some very large gauge, or I guess very heavy duty crimps, and this is what I'm going to connect my battery wires with, and particularly with that hammer lug tool that I used for making the battery cable a few episodes ago, plus some nice crimp lugs. I think I'm going to just use those copper ones, since full copper equals better electricity conduction. So that's what I'm going to start with first. Okay, quick progress update. So what I ended up doing was trying to strip back the body wiring here, and I was able to get 3 wires that I'm going to need, or I guess 2 that are then consolidated here. One of them came off of the battery terminal, the positive battery terminal post, and the other is actually the original alternator charging wire. I'm going to combine these 3 together, post this junction connector here. I'll have to double check and see what this is for, otherwise I may just delete it. Otherwise, I'm going to join these three together via the 4-gauge wire, run it underneath the chassis, and then up to the battery post. And then I'm also going to make a separate alternator wire from the alternator here to the post. And actually, I just put another lug on here just to see how it's all going to be spread out. It's kind of little hectic here. I guess you have the battery input, starter output, alternator, and then one for like the body wiring, like that powers the rest of the car. But at least in this fashion, although it is pretty stacked in this area, at least does allow me to isolate each connection and pull them off in case I need to test something. So as far as the wiring is concerned for the body, that's what I'm going to end up doing. And actually on this starter wire, it is actually the original starter motor wire, as the original starter motor wire went from the positive terminal of the battery here and then ran along the body, ran underneath the radiator here, and then down the side. There are some wires that then branched off for the manual transmission, and then the starter trigger, and then the starter power. But I was able to remove that wire completely and reuse it for this application. And the lug that goes on the starter motor there is exactly the same, and I could possibly even probably get the boot on it if I were to try hard enough, but it's probably need more hands for that operation. But I thought that was kind of cool as far as reusing wires. I didn't have to run its own separate cables. So that's already dealt with. Now time to make the rest of the connections from the left-hand side of the body here through the 4-gauge wire to the post, and then make the alternator cable. So quick intermission here. I have joined up the chassis battery connections with the blue 4-gauge wire there, and I've now extended my alternator wiring so that I can use the 1UZ alternator plug over here. Now the pin out for the alternator plug swap is extremely simple. On the 22RE side, or chassis side of Celica, you have a small black and yellow, a larger black, and a larger yellow. The black and yellow simply connect to the black and yellow of this connector. The yellow goes to yellow, and then the solid black wire on the chassis side goes to the white wire with the blue stripe on this side. I'll have a list with all of the pinouts and what goes to where in the description below. I'll either link it to like Google Drive or one of the forum posts that I'll put up so that you can see all of my notes on how everything is supposed to hook up with regard to these kind of wires. But then otherwise, then the battery cable I have on a copper lug, and that will go on my distribution post. Last thing I gotta do is just make the little connection between the alternator and the post, and then I can start to finish cleaning up and looming all of this together. I just use the regular corrugated split sleeve here, and then switched to the braided stuff because it was a little bit neater and had a better sizing on this side. And then these wires I will most likely have to delete or cut, I think, other than the noise filter, but I will double check on that just to be sure. And real quick, here's the alternator cable. Now I actually used the upper half of the stock alternator cable so that I'd have the lug with the insulator on it for the alternator side, and then just connected it to the same little bit of the 4-gauge blue wire here, and then put a copper lug on the end. And then just for thermal safety, I just put the DEI heat sleeve wire loom sleeving on it, because it's one of the wires that'll be in closer proximity to the engine than all the rest in this corner. But now it's time to route everything up and connect it to the battery distribution post. Okay, little skip here, but all of my wires are routed, so now I have battery power, starter, chassis, and alternator all hooked up, which is really good because that's another step closer to starting, so that when I turn the battery power on, or rather as I close the circuit breaker back there in the trunk, then on the rest of the chassis will get power. Now, I've routed all of my cabling down here and underneath where the radiator is. This area I've just kind of zip tied off, and it shouldn't interfere when the radiator is installed because it sits a little higher than usual. And it should not also interfere with the under tray when that's installed. These wires are now all off to the side. I'm still going to have to look and see whether those have to be removed. On this side, however, you have the chassis wire here that's meant for the starter and manual transmission. I just reloomed that in the braided material, so that will get routed along the side here. AFM connector can go. This connector can go. The AC clutch switch connector here I'll have to extend to the other side at some point. On this wire we have something perhaps unknown. This might also be for AC. I'll have to double check. But this wire here I've cut because this had the connector for the original 22RE oil pressure sending unit, and I have to find the connector that goes onto the unit on the 1UZ down here. But that I'll try to extend that wire and bring it perhaps across the front cam covers with the crank harness so that I can go down into the sensor. But yeah, this is kind of still a mess at the moment. Main thing is that these wires here, because these don't really need to be routed or placed inside this well anymore, because that's where the airbox goes, I'm thinking, just based on this perspective, that I think I may be able to get away with shortening this, where I can cut this entire middle section of wiring, just all of this down, and shorten it. And then, but of course making sure still that the ground wire here in that bundle is unaffected. I'm thinking that's gonna be the easiest way to clean up the wiring in this area, because there's just too much here. And then the rest of this will sit down in here. Yeah, that can definitely be shortened for sure. So I'll have to take this apart and resolder all these connections. It looks like I only have 5 wires off these 2 connectors here, so that should be fine. All right, with that in mind, I'm now at a stage where I don't have to necessarily continue to hook up any more wires for sensors and things like that, because I need to get under the dash and start connecting things there and actually try to test and start this thing. So what I'm going to do is try to put the air conditioning compressor back in, put the belt in, start getting the harness in, reassemble the manifolds, and then also for the hole in the firewall, I'm going to have to remove the charcoal canister and get some of the fuel lines out of the way here, and ensure that I can put the flange or bolt the flange into the firewall. And I guess I'll have to drill and riv nut into the firewall metal so that I can secure it, because previously on the 22RE harness, as you can see, there's no bolt holes or anything. It was just held in via the grommet itself. Like, I guess there's like a seal lip that would go over it, but on the Lexus it's bolted in, so I'm going to have to add a couple of holes. So I've managed to pull the wiring harness through the firewall grommet, which ends up being sort of right behind like the whole blower motor and mixer box here. In order to get my hand in there though, I did have to take out the AC cooler box that houses the evaporator. So you'll have to remove the grommet that holds the two pipes in place here on this hole in the firewall. So with that out, I pulled these through. It looks like to make it fit, I'll have to kind of rest them across the top of the blower motor box here, and then I'll get some of this loom stuff and wrap the wires up there with it for anti-abrasion. But this is how I think it's going to route through. It looks like, based on how much line there is just from the grommet through the firewall to the ends of where the connectors are, it looks like I may be able to wrap the cables sort of around the blower motor and cooler box and get the connectors here underneath the carpet, or at least under the floor, so that the ECU can then sit here in the floor, and then I can create kind of a false load floor above that, so you can still rest your feet on top of where the ECU is going to be, but without causing any damage to the ECU, because otherwise I don't want it sort of hanging around in this area, nor I think there's going to be enough room up here where the old ECU used to be above the glove box, because the ECU is larger than the stock one. It doesn't have all the same mounting points. So I'm just going to put it in the floor since we have the wiring loom length to do so. But coming back to the engine bay, we have this flange that has the grommet here for the wiring. I've marked out a couple spots where I think the flange is going to orient kind of like this. So with that marked out, I think this is going to be the orientation in which the flange can sit kind of as flat as possible. I might need to add a little bit of spacers in there to maybe offset it and create somewhat of a seal here, because this area where the flange is going to sit on is not very large and I don't want to bash any sheet metal, but I think this is going to be the best orientation for it. So I'm just going to pull this out slightly and drill these out so I can add riv nuts in. Unfortunately, I had to take a slight pause with putting these riv nuts in just because the area in here is extremely tight, and even my right angle riv nut tool can't properly get the riv nuts in here, nor was I able to neatly drill out these riv nut holes. So they weren't exactly round nor inserted into the sheet metal at a proper angle. So yeah, I ended up just having to sort of epoxy the riv nuts in here as best as I could. The level of jank here is making me cringe a little bit, but this will at least work and hold, and it's not like this is a super high torque application either. I just needed to hold the flange in place, and then once that's done, I can start routing all the rest of the wire, just because I want to make sure that this is undisturbed. I think I can possibly just bring this in as close as possible, like so, and then just actually start putting everything in here. Gee, it looks like such a mess, especially, I had to take out the fuel lines and a couple of the evap and vacuum lines in here, but I guess that's part of the job as far as making sure everything goes in properly. Also, make sure you have proper engine grounds for the back of the cylinder head. All right, so we're at a good point where everything is getting assembled. I'm routing all the harnesses and making all the different connections for different parts on the manifold. But now I'm getting to a point where this sensor here for the ECU water temp needs to be replaced because it's a little broken and the original connector nor the new one would click into it properly. So I do have a new one. Here's the part number for the new OEM water temperature sensor. And yeah, I'm just gonna quickly pop that out and replace it before making the connection via this green plug. Anyways, I just want to make that quick intermission. Otherwise, hooking everything up has been relatively simple. Before I get too crazy and start things up, I'm going to replace vacuum lines all along this section just because I have new OEM line to go in its place, as well as a couple of different lines for the throttle body coolant, and then this breather from the valve cover that end up going into the throttle body here. Because you have usually your PCV, which is on the other side, which I have the catch can for, and then just a separate breather, which does not have the check valve in it, that just goes straight into the throttle body, which ends up making your throttle plate very greasy, but I've cleaned it since. So anyways, that's what's coming next. Well, replacing the water temp sensor was successful, although just to give myself access to that sensor with a wrench, I did have to remove the front water housing, which didn't take too long. When I reinstalled it though, I put in the connection between the bleeding screw here and the IACV. So at least when I installed it, at least it went all in kind of as one unit. That way it makes a seal here with the O-ring, and then you can push the pipe all the way through and onto the IACV. Now next up for the throttle body, I just pulled that off really quick. The bolts were loose anyways. Got to get the gasket on there, but I have a brand new OE ventilation hose. There's the part number. And yeah, this is just a piece of tube that connects from this pipe on the valve cover to that pipe there, the large one underneath. So I think I'm going to retain the same hose that is here already, since it's in okay shape. It's not like super plasticky or torn. It's a slimmer size just because it's like a metric coolant pipe. And then we'll throw that all together and then start getting all the vacuum lines together. Okay, at this point I was trying to button everything up, put the throttle body on and made all my connections here, and then realized down in here we have the connector for the cold start injector, and the segment off the harness branch over here, right down in there, can't reach. And I had already made a longer segment here for the cold start injector. But the problem is that it's supposed to poke out further than this little tab where the current cold start injector connector is supposed to go to. So I have to pull off the upper intake manifold again just to put in my correctly extended harness for the injector. So, time to get back to it. Okay, well, after hours of work, I've got the engine bay assembled and put together to a point where I can, if the wiring is all set, actually start it. Now, I used a bunch of new OEM vacuum line, and here's the part number. I would recommend getting 2 of these. That should service the entire engine. This stuff is really nice. It's got this kind of like harder exterior than like softer interior to the line here, which makes it very easy to install and should make it hold up very nicely over time. And yeah, everything's now plugged in, everything's routed. The only trouble I'm having here is just with this IACV pipe. I'm thinking that the discrepancy here between the size of the hose and the size of the bung on the IACV is mainly down to the fact that I'm using an SC400 IACV because the one that was on the LS400 in the junkyard was stolen. Well, I mean, it was taken off the engine, but basically stolen from the entire assembly here. So I think that's why I'm having this discrepancy. But hopefully, with another run to the junkyard, I can find another good IACV with the correct bung on it. Got all the rest of the spark plug wires routed in too. There's a couple of awesome image results from Google. If you just look up spark plug wiring routing, the NGK plugs sit in here really nicely. I was able to route in all of the different clip holders through the channel here. So those clips helped everything route really nicely. All the harness, everything is plugged in and routed, and everything has been routed just fine. I also used NGK spark plugs and replaced all the spark plugs in this area, torqued them all down. Don't forget to use anti-seize on the threads, because that will make sure that you have an easy time getting the spark plugs back out. And coming back to the behind the engine area, I was able to route that cold start injector wire pretty easily. It's sprouting out right back there where my finger is pointing at the tip of my finger, so that connected up nicely. And finally, where the charcoal canister is reinstalled, my epoxy solution for the riv nuts held up, so I was able to bolt in the flange nice and tight, so we shouldn't have any issue, if at all, with water intrusion, but I will make sure to keep an eye on that. The rubber sits inside the flange pretty nicely, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Otherwise, like I said, yeah, everything's routed up. Got the throttle cable in, but it is still a little loose. I'm a little concerned about that just because there isn't a whole lot of adjustment range in here. But I was told by an Instagram user, I'll put their name up here, that you can use the stock LS400 cable, so I'll have to scour a junkyard to find one. I'll get to that a little bit later, but at least it won't stop me from running and perhaps driving the car around a little bit for now. But otherwise, this is the state of the engine. Intake's all mocked up in here. I had to put the MAF on its side without the airbox because of the power steering idler that I'm using at the moment. And I still haven't received the nice billet solution from XAT just yet, but that's in the works. Yeah, with no cooling system in place, I obviously can't run this for long, but shouldn't be a big issue otherwise, just to test out. But before I get under the dash, just to make sure the car can roll around on its own wheels reliably, I do want to quickly finish up the sway bar mounting area. I just got to bolt up the carriers into the frame here with my spacer solution that I had shown you previously, and then just bolt the end links to the sway bar, which I'll just do with a bolt and a bushing in between as a spacer, so that should be pretty fast. Well, there we go. Finally got the sway bar bolted in. Although I did have to take out the tension control rods so that I had enough motion in there to line everything up with my 1-inch steel spacers, but it's all mounted up, and now I'll put in the tension control rods in there now that everything's all aligned, and I should have some compliance with the tension control rod to line everything up and then bolt it all in, and I can always just pull the control arm fore and aft as needed. I did also end up getting the connections between the tie rod end and the, not the tie rod end, but rather the sway bar end link, my custom little doodad that goes into the control arm like this, and just put another like little poly bushing between the rod end and the sway bar, and just got to bolt that all together. But that's going to be hopefully my sway bar end link solution, and hopefully one that is definitely robust enough. And on the other side, ended up doing the same thing. So anyways, I can get the tension control rods in and then move. Basically, it's because it's getting pretty chilly out. I'm going to try to loop the car around, basically get the rear end in so that the passenger side is accessible from the other side where I have more room, because most of the dash wiring has to happen under there. So that's coming next. All right, quick update. I was getting the tension control rod in and noticed that I still have, well, there appears to be a little bit of contact with the sway bar and the tension control rod here. When the suspension is at full compression, I have it compressed via the jack right now. It's kind of sketchy right now, so I'm trying to get this done and over with quick. But it appears my shortened homemade end link does not appear to be the answer, because even when I have full suspension compression, I still have, well, actually that's just at resting height. That doesn't include, you know, going over bumps actually, but I think I can get away with some slightly longer end links here and deal with some of the clearance issues that I'm having with the sway bar and the sheet metal, and have that as my trade-off with it not contacting the tension control rod by using the end links that the white line sway bar here actually came with to begin with. So I'm gonna have to switch back to that, unfortunately, but I think it will allow me to solve the contact issue that I was going to hopefully solve from before. Alright, and with that, I got the tension control rods back in and put the original white line end links in, and we are back in clearance town, where we have space between this tension control rod and the sway bar. They will both move in tandem, so I don't expect this gap to close up. Perhaps I would even expect it to open up as the suspension travels here, with the compression and rebound at least. So just got to finish tightening this whole assembly up, and then we can get the car rolled out and moved around such that I can now actually start on the wiring. Alright, so I ended up pulling the car back outside here just because the weather let up a little bit and I'm not freezing my butt off, but I've got my ECU, all the connectors and everything that I need to plug between. I'll have to go and grab my 18 position connector so I can make the interface between the two. I've also got my notes to hand. I'll be posting scans of these into Google Drive and put that link in the description, so keep an eye out for that. So that's going to get all wired up, make our connection with our fourth ECU plug as well. I branched off all of the wires that I think I'm going to need to splice to, versus these branches off over this way. These will all be, I guess, I'll just not use them or de-pin them or something. But that's what's coming up next, and I'll try my best to walk you through each and every little wire that's on my note sheet here. First, though, I want to go back to the other side and take a look at that circuit opening relay. All right, so now we're on the other side of the car. First thing to find is where that circuit opening relay is back there, because we're going to replace it with the 6-pin model from the Lexus. Don't forget to get that pigtail like I showed you in the junkyard in the previous video. So let's check our notes over here. What we do know is that the circuit opening relay is here. Let's see, connector F. Aha, okay, so we know it's a 6-pin yellow connector. I wonder, that looks kind of familiar. I'm wondering if that connector is the same as the one we pulled out of the Lexus. If it is, that certainly saves us an extra soldering operation, but that's nice. All right, so with that, we know it's F, it's a yellow connector. Let me open up our electrical wiring routing here. Let's see. Okay, circuit opening relays number 14. 14. So it looks like it's underneath the fuse block here, just underneath that number O connector. And O is for floor wire and cowl wire, left kick panel. So we're looking for a yellow connector underneath this thing. Aha, there it is. So the circuit opening relay is hiding under here, so we have to pull that out. All right, so after a little more digging around to here, it looks like the circuit opening relay is held in with that little bracket there next to that ground wire, and it's held in with a 10mm bolt, so I got to attack it with that. All right, so I pulled that out real fast. Looks like the bracket is just attached to the side of the relay, but these look strikingly similar. It looks like I'll be able to use the stock bracket and possibly even the stock plug. Let's see what we can do here. All right, pulled that out. Well, I'll be darned. They're the exact same. Although, obviously, you can see in here on the yellow plug that one of the connectors is sort of blanked off, but I think we can then just de-pin this guy and put it inside this connector, because I'm willing to bet... Ha! What do you know? The original connector fits. So it looks like we don't have to do too much soldering work here. I probably just need to repin a couple of these for at least the order in which the different wires go, and then add that sixth wire in here, which one of them is going to be for the fuel pump control output signal from the ECU. So I'll have to run an additional wire across the car from the ECU and back over here to this relay, because the ECU, rather than just the key here on the Lexus, at least the way it was set up, is that the signal from the ECU turns on the fuel pump. So I'm not sure if that renders the connector under the hood any good or still functional, but at least according to my notes here, based on what I read between the two systems, that's how this one works. So you have the ECU FC fuel control signal, and that goes into the coil, which that will close the circuit between the EFI relay and the fuel pump. And there's also a deletion of the 2-speed control from the LS400, because usually there's an additional pin off the ECU that controls a fuel pump resistor circuit and basically uses a relay to switch between the two. However, I'm getting rid of it because we're just going to run this fuel pump at full speed constantly. There's no need for the 2-speed setup. Maybe it was for noise or, power consumption, but in our case, we don't necessarily need to do that. But we're still going to have the key starter signal input from both of them. We still need the EFI power signal input from either of them. One of these will need the 7.5 amp ignition in power, which is what's going to power the ECU, because it's a low side drive. It's going to power the ECU signal. So I'll have to find that wire. And it looks like, I guess from the way that this is going to wire up, the check connector that's in the engine bay, I think we may end up getting rid of that. Or I think the way to ensure that this still works is by tying this wire on pin number 4 for the fuel pump check connector into the same pin, actually. Okay, we'll keep the same pin. We just have to tie in the ECU control. So actually, that's what we have to do. Well, to keep the fuel pump check connector active in the engine bay, we won't modify this wire, but rather just add the ECU connection. And by making sure that we have the additional pin here, that will get the power input signal from the ignition fuse instead. I have to check where this bridge is being done inside. Maybe it's inside of the relay. My bet is that this bridge here is happening inside of the relay. So using the LS400 one here will cause that to not be bridged, and each individual circuit will have its own line. There's not going to be like sharing of pins between the different circuits. So that's what we're going to have to do. Okay, quick intermission here to show you what I've done. So first I spliced in the green wire that I'm going to take across the car for the fuel control pin on the ECU, and that's just spliced into pin number 4 here on the connector, and I just soldered that in. I ended up using just a razor blade to strip away some of the insulation, and then twist the additional wire around, soldered in, covered it in some electrical tape. But now up here, this particular plug here off of the fuse block, this is labeled as 2I in the service manual book. I'll show you over here. So coming here, we have the 7.5 amp ignition fuse that comes off of the key switch and comes back around into junction connector 2I pin 9, and that is a black and red wire. 2I looks like that. 2I looks like that. That's the pin, as if you were looking at the back of the connector. Or sorry, the front of the connector. And yeah, the front of the connector. So then pin 9, everything's pretty crowded back here. So pin 9 would be this one here that the tip of my thumb is pointing to, if my camera would focus. And then there's the black and red wire on the back, and similarly stripped the wire a little bit, got a additional little red wire here soldered to it. It's really tight in this area, so take your time and be patient. But we'll plug that guy back in. And now we have this additional red wire that I soldered. That's going to come off, and that will splice, I guess I'll solder that into this additional pin here, which has this black and orange stripe wire on it, and that will go into pin position 5 here. And then that should sort out everything we need in order to use the LS400 circuit opening relay, which thankfully ended up being pretty simple. So I'm really thankful for that, because everything else, pin wise appears to be very similar. We already have our ground in place. The fuel pump is still off of pin number 1. We still have the EFI main relay power. And then, then all we're adding on the circuit opening relay side for the LS400 here is the 7.5 amp ignition in, which is what we just soldered into from connector 2I. So, time to finish that all up. Alright, so the Lexus circuit opening relay is installed and bolted up, mounted up back there on that original metal bracket there. And then I routed the fuel pump control wire up and through the dash, and now it's here on the other side. So now we're pretty much done here under the dash on the left-hand side of the car. We don't need to necessarily pull the key start signal from under here, because there's already a wire for it under there on the body plugs. So we're going to wrap up our area here and move everything to the other side. Alright, so now we're on the right hand side of the car. Gonna get here under here in the dash. I've connected up the ECU to the 3 plugs on the loom so far, but we're gonna have to splice into these 2 plugs here, and then these 2 down here off of the ECU loom branch. So I'm gonna try to keep things as clear as possible, because there's a bunch of other wiring, like stuff I had added to add power windows. But let's see, first on our list here is, let's see, body plug 1, pin 6, 15 amp stop, which is a constant 12 volt fuse. It's a green and white wire, and that has to connect to engine pin 11, pin 26. So E11 P26. So that's the 4th ECU plug. This is a black and yellow wire. So if we come to our ECU plug here, pin 24 would be over here, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. And here's our black and yellow wire. So I'll have to splice that into body plug 1, pin 6. And body plug 1, pin 6, I have so labeled, is, let's see, we have BP1, body plug 1. It's this wider yellow connector here. And it's going to be pinned out, labeled as if you are, god damn it, if you are looking at it like so. So that means body plug 1, pin 6, it's 15 amp stop power, green, white. Pin 6 is the 6th from top row left, and that means that is pin 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that should be a, let's see, that's a green and white wire, and we have green and white. So that's kind of how we're going to be going through and making each connection. So first I'll probably depin this plug, get rid of the green and white wire here, and then come in and pin it here to the, or add an extension to this wire here, and then pin it. And what I'm going to do for that is I have this connector system, which funny enough kind of looks like OEM ECU connectors, but they're a little bit larger than that. They're TE connectors. They're both 18 position plugs, so you have up to 18 wires here we can splice in. We won't need all of them because some of the wires in my list were actually, and I lied earlier, we're going to pull back from the left-hand side of the car here because there's a connection we have to intercept, because the ECU is now going to control one of the main relays via the circuit opening relay instead of it being via the key. Although one side will still need the switched key power, and I'll show you which side is which, and that's coming next after this first plug. But mainly I'm going to use these plugs here to make the connection between this side and this side, and because I'm obviously these connectors, I don't have the mating sides to them, and neither for these, so I figure one new connector to consolidate all of our new connections will be really good, plus with brand new pins. I'll put the part numbers for all these different parts in the description. They should be pretty easy to get or source, and you can probably even find a connector set that has at least 18 positions in it of your own choosing. You might want a sealed one, you might not, who knows, but I'll show you which one I end up using. So first step is to splice that first 12 volt battery constant power wire. Well, I was on my way to get that first pin going on the connectors here. I did the male receptacle side first. I'm going to make that on the car side, and then on the female receptacle side, the pin housing is a little unique. You can see each one has like a little plus sign in it or something like that, and I think that's because one mistake I made here with buying these pins is that it looks as though the configuration of the pin is meant such that it's supposed to go with a vertical male pin instead. Even though I tried slotting the pin in with it horizontally, it won't work. So I don't think these are actually the right pins. I didn't realize there were two configurations. But on the bright side though, what I noticed I can do still is I can still take the connector here with the pin, although I can't put this pin inside of the connector body. I can at least slot them in and still have them sort of held together like this, at least for testing purposes. Actually, this might work out better in case I need to do some troubleshooting or something like that, but I'll make sure to buy the right pins, and then I'll have to install them a little later. With that sorted out, so we can at least continue, next up on the list, numbers 2 and 3. See, we have E10 P1, which is the third ECU connector, pin 1, IGSW ignition switch, which is accessed via the EH1 P2 plug. So EH1 is this guy right here. So pin number 2 right up here, that's this black and orange wire here. So that BO, black orange, is, let's see, it's ignition switch via that plug. So you access this pin from that plug, and that needs to have ignition switched power from the 7.5 amp ignition fuse like we were pulling earlier for the circuit opening relay. However, the main difference is that it's going to come off of plug K here, and K in the square, this green plug here, pin 1, both the mating sides, pin number 1 has the black and red wire that have the power off of the 7.5 amp ignition fuse. So what we're going to have to do is then on the other side, via the 4th ECU plug, pin number 4, which is another black-orange wire. So pin number 4 ends up being this wire right here, this other black-orange wire. This needs to get connected to the main relay output, because the main relay is now triggered by the ECU via this pin. So on one side of the K plug, one side is the power side, and on the other side is the signal to the main relay to close it. So from our system diagram here, we have the fuse, 7.5 amp ignition, which goes through 2I, pin 9, which we've already accessed earlier for the circuit opening relay. We're now going to go down to that K plug, which is under the dash there somewhere. You can see one of those green plugs, hopefully back there. So the one side with the arrows indicates which side is the male side, and the one without indicates which side is the female side. So coming back to this, it means that the power side source is the side of the K connector with the male pins in it, and the side that needs to connect to number 3 here, E11P4, that has to then be connected to this wire here off of the 4th ECU plug. So we'll have to string another wire across and under the dash to that connection point, as well as another wire with the male pins to come all the way across and activate the ignition switch pin on number 2. So instead of splicing into the circuit like we did for pin number 9 on connector 2I, we're instead going to be intercepting the circuit completely. So with that, we have to get 2 wires strung across and make sure that they go into the proper places. So that's what I'm going to do first. Alright, so I pulled my wires through. I'll be sure to label, in my notes at least, which wire is which so that I know what I'm dealing with when I come back to the other side. But I'm going to pull these through, and under here, you can see the connector that I've already split here. It's a 10-pin green connector, and yeah, pin 1, the black and red wires off of each are the ones we will be intercepting. You can see the female receptacle plug there, and the male receptacle there, and based on my notes and the diagram once more, the male side is the side that gets the power from the fuse, and that's going to go to number 2, E10P1 ignition switch via EH1P2. And then the side that has the female pin on the black-red wire is going to go to number 3, E11P4 main relay trigger output, which is going to go, at least from the car side, so it'll come out of the ECU, go across the car via one of our wires, back into that plug, which then goes in and triggers the EFI main relay. So that's how we're intercepting the circuit so that it works like the 1UZ. We're essentially making the ignition and starting system under here work like the LS400 with use of only stock relays and none others. The EFI main relays, one that's in the kick panel, one that's in this junction box, and one that's in the corner of the car over there, those are the ones we're all going to be using via the wires under here. And of course, other than the addition of that circuit opening relay we added, everything is still pretty stock. So this is kind of the cleanest execution I could come up with based on what the car has available as far as its available circuits. So of course, when it comes to working in the corner under here, the connectors here are even tighter against the body, so it's going to be really tough. But again, maintain patience, stay calm, work slowly, and make sure you make reliable connections. I think just based on making things easier for myself, I'm going to de-pin the connectors and then just solder the wires straight onto them. I think that'll be the easiest route out. All right, my soldered connections are made. I've plugged in the green connectors back together again. Oh geez, it's dark in here. I wonder if, there we go. I've connected all my green connectors, routed all my wiring back up, including the fuel control. That's going to go up and through the steering column, same way. You can kind of see them routing under there. and then we'll go back to the other side. And from there, I've just pulled them through with the same wire. So I'm gonna get back to pinning these guys up. Now, I made green come off of K1, the male pin, so that's the source from the 7.5 amp fuse. And then the white wire is off of the female pin on K1, which means that it's going to the main relay output trigger, which then is output from pin number E11P4 on MRAIL, black-orange. Right here. So that's gonna go back up through the white wire and then go inside the car under the hood to trigger the main relay. All right, so now those wires are taken care of and I've slotted them into the connector here. This is feeling kind of sketchy now, having no connector body because I have the wrong pins, but that's something I can fix later. Now next on my list, I have, let's see, numbers 4 and 5, and these are EH1P13 and EH1P3. So coming off of this connector again, EH1P3, that's this black and red right here, and EH1P13 is, let's see, 13 I think is this, what's brown, what's this other wire? Okay, there you go, that's also this black and red, so that's 13, which is right here, the second to last on the bottom row, where the tip of my thumb is pointing. So let's see, those are, so yeah, both black and red. There's B, ECU battery, battery 1, and the battery power for the IACV motor. Now these, I guess, are switched, which, yeah, so tied together, get them from EFI main relay number 1, and that output is found on body plug 1, pin 15, which is a black and yellow wire. And going back to the connector diagram here, pin 15 is underneath number 6, which we've already accessed before, and 15 is black and yellow as well. So we take a look here. There it is, there's the black and yellow. So we're gonna pull that one out and string it along to both of those wires here, the black and red here, and the other black and red there, to string them together so they both have the correct battery power signal. Okay, so turn this light back on. That now takes care of the 12 volt switch power for the IACV and the ECU switched power. And that's gonna come in right here off of this wire. I'm basically having to extend the wires that come off of the body right here so that they come down to the plug, because I think I'll keep the plug kind of like underneath the blower motor here when all is said and done. However, the spook has started to roll in, so I'm gonna pull the car in, and that way we also have some more light. All right, so I've moved everything back into the garage here where I'm covered, I have light, it's warm, but so here's the plan. I have 5 wires hooked up right now, and they are the first 5 here on the list. Constant 12 volt battery, switched ignition from the 7.5 amp ignition fuse, main relay trigger output, ECU switched battery power, and switched battery power for the IACV motor. Now, to actually get this thing running, and I don't need to hook up all of these tonight, so I think the next ones I'll get to here are actually 7 and 8. So that's EH1P8 and EH1P7. Makes things really easy because they're both starter motor triggered signals, and I'm just going to tie them together. The first one is STA, which is the cold start activation, and we'll just tie that to the key switch. And yeah, so my solution on the Celica side is key start trigger wire. And then number 8 for EH1P7 is the actual starter motor trigger, which is tied to the STA here. I guess they're tied together somewhere in the plug or in the ECU bundle. Either way, that is the one is the smaller wire with dots, and another is a larger black wire with larger dots. And we're going to pull that from body plug 1, pin 3, which is the ignition switch signal ST or start, which is straight up from the key, and that's just one big black wire. So that's what I'm going to get to next. Alright, so my connection is made here. I ended up just splicing into the single large wire here that was on EH1P7, the larger wire, and that's what's here, because I guess it's tied later on to the smaller one, which you can see right there, as my finger is pointing to. As the smaller black wire with the silver dots here. And so I just connected this straight to the black wire off of the body plug, and I've just soldered them in for now. I will put them on a separate connector later, but this is quite a large, possibly a high power line, so I'm going to leave that on its own and not consolidate it with the separate little 18-pin plug that I've put together. So now, next here is number 9, EH1P12 injectors and coil pack 12 volt power input, black and orange wire. And here I wrote pull wire from circle B, yellow connector, pin 1, black and red. So where is circle B connector, pin 1? Okay, here we go. EFI system, circle B, yellow, single pin. And what this is it's a black and red wire that goes to the fuel injector resistors initially, but it comes off of EFI main relay number 2 and comes directly from one of the fuse links here, which I think this relay, if we go to starting and ignition systems, this relay seems to also serve the coil pack as well. So this will be able to serve our single line here where we need coil pack and injector power. And it looks like, see, this trigger signal comes off of here, and then the power, it's black-red, comes off of 2F. I still don't see circle B. Maybe there's a better place to get this. Where is the square F? F is green. And it comes off of, let's see, pin 2. But then I want to see how high up the line we can get this. So EFI main relay is G. G is a yellow. Aha, so it's part of the original bundle here, and there's my black and red wire. So there's your power, because there's the circle, there's the green, but then let's see, the EFI main relay, I think is on the other side. So let's see, yeah, here we go. Here's our circle plug. It has 4 wires coming out of it, and it's coming off of EFI main relay. There you go. So in here, we need the black and red wire for the correct signal. I see black and yellow. Oh, I see, here we go. Black and yellow comes off of the other side of this plug, and then I guess goes across the car, because yeah, there's the black and red again. So, yeah, there's the black and red again, and that comes in here in these body plugs and goes across to the other side. So I guess that's our relay output source. So somehow I'll need to get a connector or get a wire from here and bring it back inside the car, but I don't want to pull it back through the flange, although that would probably be the best way to do it. There's no, I guess, clean or easy way to do it, I suppose. Okay, new plan. After having a little look around, I found the single pin yellow connector here that was normally meant to go to the injector resistors. I'm going to pull off of that here using this bit of wire and a spade terminal that I've crimped on. I'm just going to plug that in, because realistically right now I want to get this thing cranking before midnight, and this will also help to confirm and test that I've got everything right. So I'm going to run this wire in a very unsavory way through the door like that, and just have it kind of hang out here on top of the engine bay. Yeah, like I said, it's not best, but I think this is going to be more for a functional check than anything else. But it'll also let me know if that's a good source for ignition power. So then coming back under here, what we'll do is then wire into EH1 pin 12, which here on the connector is that one right there, the black and orange that my index finger is on right there. All right, so I got that wire carried over in here and now soldered in. Like I said, I'm just trying to do a functional check at this point as I want to get her started. So next on our list then we have, next now will be, all right, we've already covered this a little bit, but number 10, E11 P8 FC, or fuel pump control, the circuit opening relay. It is green and black. It's on the 4th ECU plug, pin 8. That is right here. So we've already pulled that through via our Kermit green wire over here, so I'm just going to splice those together real quick. And then finally, since I want to accelerate this a little bit, we're going to come to the end of the list, as I'm not going to worry about the O2 sensors at the moment, or the water temp sensors, or speed signal or tach signal. What I'm going to come to now is the last two grounds. So we have E11 P14 and EH2 P10. They're both large brown ground wires. So E11 P14. That is seemingly unused. Okay, if that's the case, truly, then the only other one we need is on EH2, which is back here, and would be on pin 10, but is also seemingly missing. Huh, I may have consolidated the grounds in here or perhaps earlier on in the engine bay. So, it's weird that those pins are missing because I did not necessarily take them out. I see a brown ground. Oh, never mind. Here we go. Here's EH1 P14. Okay, I guess I made a mistake in writing it because that should be EH1. Or sorry, E11 should not be written here. It should be EH1 pin 14 because there's your brown ground wire. But then that does mean there's no ground then on EH2 P10 because I'm not seeing that either. Because in that case, pin 10 would be, let's see, this one here where my thumb is on, and you can see there's no pin inside of it. Okay, that means all we have left is the fuel pump control here on this little green wire, and then finally grounding that somewhere in the chassis here. I think there might be a good grounding point in here somewhere. I kind of want to tuck it along on the inside of the cowl wire here. Wondering if there's a good spot. Okay, maybe right there next to this speed control box. Speed control box. Nice naming there. But I think what I'll do is I'll put it along. There you go. There, I'll use that bolt there that's mounting this yellow speed control box. All right, let's get this thing running. All right, well, got everything hooked up. So at this point, in theory, the car should start up. In theory. So I'm gonna push it outside and see how it does. But first, I do want to check to make sure that everything's okay when I connect the battery. So I'm gonna just quickly close the circuit breaker here. So I'm gonna quickly close the circuit breaker here and make sure nothing blows up. Haha, gotcha. Well, don't see anything catching fire. There's the key. Let's see. Make sure the key is okay. Okay. Everything's good so far. Now, one thing I want to check is to see if that fuel pump override connector still works. So, just gonna get that out of the way. The ignition on, I'm gonna go in here, get that little plug. I got a piece of little Mickey Mouse wire here. Just gonna plug it in, see if the fuel pump turns on. It did! It did! Oh my god. I heard the circuit opening relay. Oh, I dropped my wire. Okay, good. So that's a great diagnostic feature that I've still retained by doing the circuit opening relay wiring the way I did. All right, let me just try that one more time. You can probably hear the fuel pump go. Whoa! Oh shit! Well, that's a separate issue. The car just sprayed me with gasoline. He was more excited than I was. All right, well, that's a good reminder to myself to make sure everything's tightened down, particularly the fuel, because that could mean fire. Oh gee, now my clothes are gonna stink like gasoline. Well, that's the least of my worries at this point. Let me tighten up. I think that happened, yeah, it looks to be it happened at the fuel filter. Okay. Well, good to know that that plug still works to override the fuel pump, and the fuel pump works. This means I wired the fuel pump correctly, as well as the circuit opening relay. Oh man, that's exciting. All right, let me get in there, tighten things up, clean up, and we'll push it outside to start it up. Okay, after a little bit of headache, I found a lot of my leaks were basically at every single fuel fitting that I hadn't tightened down, which was all of them. So we had the one at the return, the one at the feed for the back, the ones at the fuel filter, and the one that comes off of the chassis hard line, which connected to that M14 by 1.5 fitting down there. But now, if I tickle the connector, we have circulation and no leaks. So that's a pass. I'm gonna take the car down because I had to jack it up to reach from underneath it, put it back down, and we're gonna turn the key. Oh, but before I forget, I did mark myself down. We have to put some oil in. Definitely not going to crank and try to start it without oil. Don't want to grenade a motor I just barely put in, you know? All right, so we got our funnel. We're gonna start feeding in. We got some 5W30. The capacity is 6 quarts. So, or officially 5.8 quarts, but I figure with the extra line that I have going for the oil filter adapter, it'll be about 6. So we're gonna fill this up first. All right, and with that, the most vital fluid for the engine finally filled, let's get this thing rolled out and give it a shot. All right, so I'm gonna have Paul get in here and do the honors of turning the key. So don't touch the key just yet. It's still in the ignition on position. I'm going to come back here, turn the circuit breaker back on, which I have done. Actually, I'll leave the trunk open just in case I need to run and turn it off.
That's a good extra kill switch too.
It is an extra kill switch. All right, I'm going to turn the
protection.
interior lights on so we can see what's going on. All right, fired up. Are you turning it?
Yeah.
Oh, you're joking. Oh, never mind. Okay, that was a little anticlimactic. We think the battery is just kind of dead because I'm hearing the relays click as he turns the starter, as he turns the key on and turns it to start. But I'm just not getting any feedback from the starter motor, which I know I've hooked up and I know I've connected to my battery distribution post here. So we're just gonna get the battery on a trickle charger real fast and just see if that helps it along. Okay, never mind. I found out what was going on. I forgot to connect these transmission wires, which as you can see has a loop in it because that's to bypass the neutral safety. So I was basically telling the car I'm not in Parker neutral. On the car side, not necessarily the 1UZ ECU side. Now I just gotta make sure I'm tucked these away to make sure they're not gonna stay on the exhaust here too badly. Just have to zip tie them later. Or, oh, there we go. I just kind of shoved it between the fuel line for now. So, okay, those are relatively out of the way, but it's not like I'm gonna have the car on for a long period of time. The O2 sensors are also not in as well, but I don't necessarily need that to at least here to start. Well, okay, so the starter solenoid, we're hearing that kick in, but we know that the battery is not supercharged. right now, so we should probably actually get it on the trickle charger or something. Actually, I have a jump pack. Hang on a second. Got a best starter jump pack here. Looks like the battery system is good. All right, I'm gonna turn that on. Give it a try. Nope. I hear it running the fuel pump. I'm not actually sure this jump pack is doing anything.
I don't think that's it.
You know, the starter is connected though.
Yeah, but the starter's not even trying.
I know, but I know I put the battery cable on there, or a cable for the starter motor in there.
Tested the starter motor?
No, I have not while it was out, and I probably that's actually a good idea. I probably should have done that while I was had everything off with the intake manifold, because I rebuilt it. But okay, I think we
the lights really bright.
the right lights are brighter now. Okay, don't start it just yet. Okay, just want to show you, I got my Celica's old battery, which still had a bunch of charge, hooked up in parallel, so I think we might be in decent shape. Give it a shot. Nope, don't hold it, please. Just try to click it.
Do me a favor, unhook that battery. Let me just see what happens.
Okay, still not doing it, but all right, try. I hear the fuel pump running still.
Battery has enough charge. It's the connection to the starter. Either the solenoid, is the solenoid clicking pretty good?
I can hear it, yeah, but here, let me get my hand down here. Don't touch it. Are you hands off?
Hands on.
And when you try to turn it, don't hold it, please. Just click, because if it'll go, it'll go. I didn't say do it. I'm just saying when you do it. Stop, please.
I'm gonna kick it.
Try it. Stop. I'm trying to jiggle the wires underneath where the starter motor is, but I know I have a reliable connection between the starter and the battery post though. Try it again. Oh my God, it's going. Oh my God, don't stop. Keep trying.
Should I gas it?
A little bit.
You have no,
It's fine. We're gonna run for a very short. Oh yeah. Stop.
put the extra battery on.
Oh my God, it is plugged in. Okay, try again. Stop. Oh my God, it's trying, dude. What's preventing you though? We have the ICV hose. I can't get that on fully, but I'll give it a shot. Try again. Stop. Yeah, I know. I smell electrical.
I do too.
Hmm.
It's not coming from in here.
It's not?
No. Because I smell it from outside.
Okay. All right, well, I'm gonna try to crank the engine a little bit and then all right, crank it again. Stop. Oh my God, it's trying to. It's trying. Oh my gosh. Stop. Still smell a little bit of electrical. Oh my God, it's so close. It's trying. The electrical smell is kind of concerning me, but it's trying to fire up. All right, well, I pulled her back in after many an unsuccessful attempt to actually get her to fire up. I suspect that there's something to do with the way I've done my ignition power wiring and whatnot, because I can see, I can smell the fact that we have fuel. I can hear the cold start injector. I have to rotate the engine a little bit every time I want to try to get the starter to kick in properly, so that's been kind of an issue, but at least I can hear the solenoid clicking away. And yeah, definitely I'm smelling fuel, so I'm wondering if maybe my IACV pipe is an issue, my source for ignition is an issue, and perhaps my lack of O2 sensors is an issue. But that shouldn't actually start it from trying to fire up, although I'll keep these things in mind next time I try to fire it up. But for now, good night. Alright, well, I report to you now from under the dash, and I can tell you that so far at least, all of my fuses are still good, so I haven't blown anything under here. I mean, I know for a fact the circuit opening relay is working just based on my fuel pump functionality and everything, but the issue now is that I'm just not getting spark, and I have to figure out exactly why. The plugs are completely soaked, and there's definitely no spark output, so somehow, even though my ignition source is good, the coils are not getting power. So according to the factory service manual here, to check the cam's position sensor and the crank's sensors, the resistance values of them should be between 950 to 1250 ohms, and that is done by, I guess, reading the taking the two pins off the connector and reading the resistance. So that's pretty straightforward. So that's another thing I'll make sure to check. All right, so quick status update. So earlier I checked with my voltmeter to make sure I actually had good 12 volt power for the ignition out of the plug that I tapped into, which I did. But then after kind of smelling all this fuel and thinking about it a little further, I pulled off spark plug number 1, pulled it out, and realized it was super wet. It had been basically flooded with gas, and I was also getting no spark. So that's another thing I realized I need to look into. While I have a good ignition source, I'm not actually getting spark at the coils. So my next course of action, I'm going to check the cams and crank sensors, and the OEM resistance spec is in the book. And then with that, I also realized I didn't put any main engine ground wires. Although I have good strong cranking, the rest of the engine isn't necessarily grounded. I don't have any ground between my transmission and chassis hooked up. I don't have the one from the back of the engine block to the chassis, or the front or side of the engine block to the chassis. So I definitely need to make sure I add that as well. However, I'm not able to just check my timing though, because I don't have spark, so the timing gun won't have anything to trigger off of. So I can only check to make sure my timing is okay once I know I will have spark, which then if I know my timing is bad, then I have to pull everything off of the front of the engine in order to make sure that my timing belt was aligned properly, which if you remember from my engine rebuild episodes, I double checked twice and realized I was wrong the first time. Hopefully, correcting myself this for the second time, I got it right from doing it, and hopefully I don't have to pull this apart, although I have pretty decent access in here to do it. So my next course of action is going to be putting in my ground wires, putting in my O2 sensors. Even though they don't necessarily help the car start, they do help it run a little bit better. I'm going to check my sensor resistances and try again. But I also wanted to thank everybody who's been messaging me on Instagram tonight. You know who you are. I've gotten so many suggestions on what to look for and a lot of good brainwaves, and that's given me a lot of the ideas on what to look for, because yeah, simply without the sensors being in good shape, I won't get any power at the ignition coil because the ECU doesn't think that there's a signal in there. So a lot of great suggestions, a lot of good things to look at, so it's time to get to it. Alrighty, there is the left-hand O2 sensor. It's plugged in up there, and the right-hand O2 sensor. Where did it go? Aha! Here you go. It's now pointing in the opposite direction just because of how we welded it. Also plugged in. It's also very close to this pre-cat, although I have that DEI heat wrap stuff going up the loom there. Looks like I'll have to do a pretty decent job here of trying to secure the wire, maybe via a P-clamp to this bracket, and then perhaps putting some other kind of wrap around this connector just to protect these guys from the heat so they don't melt, because I've been told that does happen. But there you go, O2 sensors are in, so now time for the next item. Alright, I came back to the rear portion of the transmission, and I do have the original ground wire in. That's probably why I at least got the crank to get going. But yeah, it's hooked up to the mount on one side and the cross member on the other, so at least that one is in. Alright, quick status update. I've added my O2 sensors in, as you saw, and now I've gone through and checked the resistances of all of my sensors, and they're all good. The spec is between 950 ohms to 1.25 kilo ohms. The left-hand crank sensor tested at 1.087 kilo ohms. The right crank angle sensor tested at 1.072 kilo ohms, and my crank angle sensor here tested at 1.052 kilo ohms, which is all between the spec. They're on the higher end, but they all are within spec, which tells me that these are good, but still doesn't tell me whether or not these are producing the signals correctly, as I've done some messing with the front crank harness and extending wires and changing the plug and whatnot. So that may be something I have to look at later. But for now, at least I know that the sensors are all good. So I'm going to plug it all back in. And now with my O2 sensors and ground wires in, I'm going to give it another try. All right, let's close the circuit breaker. Get in here. All right, ignition power on. Well, it sounded more promising, but a little more promising, yeah. What do you think? I still don't think I'm getting spark.
Yeah, you probably don't have spark, and you've got a good ground, so it should just start. It should crank.
Which it seems to be doing, but I still smell fuel.
Yeah, because you have no spark.
Why would I still not have spark? All my sensors are in spec, so it should be getting that. Can you go inside and try cranking it, please? I'm just going to,
I don't want to gas. You've got so much gas in your face.
It's okay. Still no spark as far as I can feel. Try it. Oh, strong solenoid power, but it's not cranking anymore. Okay, stop. That's enough. But I didn't feel or see any spark while it was cranking when it did there briefly. Darn. So anyways, I guess I didn't fix my problem yet, even though I thought I took care of a couple of items that I needed to take care of. Alright, well, the diagnosis shall continue. Alright, so after even further attempts to get this started up last night, I still haven't gotten that much closer. I did have a nice 1 hour long call with one of the awesome members of the Dragon community, and we went through a lot of the wires and things that should be there based on his kind of keep it simple wiring approach and versus the way I did it, which was more by the book. There were 4 wires under the dash we had to check to make sure all had 12 volt power, 2 black and red wires, 2 black and orange wires, and they all did. What we ended up finding was that I was getting intermittent voltage at the coil packs themselves. So somehow those are not getting voltage. I'm going to check the igniters to make sure they're good and that they're actually going to properly send signal to the coils. And failing that, I'm going to try to supply voltage directly to the coil packs and kind of, at least from the battery or some other source here, or possibly one of those plugs where I can just bypass the wiring harness entirely. Because then what that'll tell me is that my harness might actually be bad, or it might be just so old that there's a bunch of breaks in the harness from me having manipulated it all over the place while rebuilding it. So there is that possibility. Another thing I did want to try, based on some feedback from some more members of the community, was to go back in there and hook up the neutral safety switch wire, or at least just tie it into the STA pin with the key start. I don't see how that will help just based on the diagram and what it's meant to inhibit, because it's meant to inhibit the starter motor, which we are able to crank, but maybe it's somehow a signal that the ECU needs to have. Whatever the case may be, I'm going to try all those things out. And then if none of that ends up working and I still don't get my car to fire up, or then I have to then supply the voltage directly to the coils, it could mean pulling the harness out to do some repairs again. And during that call, we also came back in here and I ended up hooking up the check engine light and the brake signal wire because, I don't know, maybe sometimes an auto doesn't necessarily like to start when you're not pressing the brake pedal. Who knows? I ended up hooking those up, and with the check engine light, however, I ended up getting my check engine light to illuminate, and with the pins in the diagnostic port in the engine bay, E1 and TE1 jumped. It was able to read codes in case there are any. And what happened was the check engine light would flash continuously, which indicates that there are no stored codes. So it's not like it's reading that anything is wrong, mostly because, well, simply the engine just hasn't started up. But that's another thing we got up to while looking for the wires that needed all the 12-volt power, and they all did have it. Okay, it's another night, so time to try again with tackling getting this engine running. One of the first things I did was actually take a wire here. Again, very messy and jumbled, but this is just my test. I took the pin here off of the EH2 connector, pin number 6 for the neutral safety, tied it to the key start signal up here, because I didn't think you would need to connect the neutral safety per Kel's notes, but as it turns out, you do need it to start. Like, you can't just leave it open circuit, despite the fact that it tries to trigger a starter relay on the LS400. I guess you'll still need it in order to begin the car, because what I found from doing that was, like, it's now trying to start as a result of that. Because now the cold start injector's firing, it's receiving the neutral safety, telling the ECU that we're in park neutral while starting. It's beginning to take some spark to the engine while cranking, which is good. However, I then tested to make sure that I had voltage at the injectors, so I took this injector plug down here, pulled it out, and made sure I had 12 volts on it with the ignition on, which I did, and that was good. Then I took the left-hand coil here, took the plug out, put one pin on the black and red wire for the power side, grounded the other, checked the key, 12 volts there. So both had 12 volt power, which is good. However, this means that as it's trying to start, it's not clicking over to run once the engine is done starting, and I take my hand off the key start signal, which then kind of points back at the igniters. So next what I'm going to do is make sure that the igniters are receiving the pulse from the ECU, or rather that they're outputting that pulse first. So what I'm going to do is taking a look at the diagram here, we're going to look at IGT on igniters 1 and 2. One's a black-white wire, one's a brown-yellow wire, and they're on pin 2 of each of the connectors. And what we're going to do is apply power to them while we have one of the spark plug wires on each side taken off. That will determine if the igniters can be manually triggered, because that is the trigger signal from the ECU to pulse via a square wave. So we'll manually trigger it and make sure that we can actually produce spark from the igniters, and that the igniters are sending that signal to the coils. Because if that's good, that'll tell me that the igniters are good, but then somehow they're not actually receiving signal from the ECU because of my wire extension job or what have you. So there might be some issue there. So that's what I'm going to test next. So for this test procedure, I'm going to take actually the coil plug wire off of the distributor and put it near ground somewhere. So I'm going to put it like back here so it can create a little spark gap off of the fuel rail, like so. And then for the other side, I'm going to take this coil pack wire off, and I'm going to put it really close to the power steering pump so it can arc off of that. So we have a pretty decent little spark gap, so we can truly and very easily see whether or not those are arcing. Now next, I'm going to take these connectors off, and with my depinning tools from the wiring harness video, I'm going to depin pin number 2. So looking at the face of the connector with the retention tab on top, it's number 1, then 2. So that one here, which is there's the brown and yellow wire, and the other one, which is a black and white wire. So I'm going to depin those, and then use the paper clip here to bridge the gap between the pin and the connector on the igniter, and then get a separate wire off of my 12-volt bus here and use that to manually trigger the igniters. And if we see spark occur at the ends of the spark plug wire, we know we have good igniters. All right, so I've bridged the connector here with a paper clip. I've got my alligator clip sitting on that as well. So I'm basically tied into the igniter to trigger it manually via the green wire here. I'll put it on the distribution post, and I should see a spark here off of that wire. Okay, good. So that tells me that igniter does work. So now we'll test the other one. Good, we're making contact. So now this one should light up. There we go. Some good arcing off of that wire, which tells me that both my coils work and both my igniters work. But now the conclusion of why the engine does not start after the key is turned off, even though it's really trying to when the key is turned, now that a neutral safety wire is correctly tied to the key switch, is simply because the ECU cannot send the pulses to the igniters properly. So the code 14 that I got on the check engine light before I reset the battery earlier, stating that there was an igniter circuit system fault, was correct, because the ECU simply cannot make that IGT connection, and conversely, there is a confirmation signal that goes back to the ECU, basically a two-way communication here that ECU says, here's ignition signal, did we get it back? And being that's not the case, we're also not even seeing any spark. All right, go back here, close my circuit breaker. Now, give it a shot. So weird, it's really trying. Very strange. I'm still not seeing that code for the igniters on the check engine light. Then again, I've been disconnecting and reconnecting the battery. I still have E1 and TE1 bridged here, just so I can say if it were to fire, I can check my base timing. Oh, that's kind of fallen out, but shouldn't be an issue. Just because I'm making sure to reseat it every time. What can I possibly be missing? Alright, as far as I can tell, there's only one possible explanation left as to why the ECU is not communicating to the igniters. And I read about a lot of capacitor problems on these old ECUs. They use those quaternary ammonium salt capacitors that leak, although they were good and fast response at the time back in the 80s and 90s. I think it was what in the late 90s, I think then Toyota switched up the capacitors that they used because of those problems. So it's very likely that I am seeing those same issues too. And I guess we'll find out. It's a moment of truth. Oh, thank you, Toyota, for making a dual-sided board. You have a board on one side and a board on the other, as it turns out. All right, let me pull apart this a little bit more, and I'll get back to you. Okay, so I've pulled the ECU apart, and what I suspected about the capacitors does not seem to be true. They all look very clean, at least all the ones that I can see. Their solder points are very clean. There's no corrosion or signs of leaking as far as I can see. There's the other ones. So everything looks really clean in here. So At this point, I'm rather stumped. There's probably something I'm missing that I simply haven't looked at, or the way I've wired something up is maybe not correct. I guess I'll have to just study the books a little bit more. So I think that's going to conclude part 2 of this wiring video. I was hoping to really get it to fire up fully for you guys, but as far as the troubleshooting is going, it'll have to continue. So I think I'll continue some of this troubleshooting offline, considering there's a lot of excitement this past week from everybody on Instagram and folks commenting on even Facebook, where I posted on my own personal site of what I could possibly do. And as it turns out, thus far, no luck, unfortunately. So I'll keep digging into it. I'm not giving up by any means. At least it'll give me a look into where, when part 3 comes out, how to fix this sort of problem once I get it figured out. So until then, I'll see you in the next one.